mice of Utopia recognized it the moment it began. First, the camera in their enclosure stopped moving. The mice didn't need to hear the sounds of his mirthless chuckling. Long before Demon could be heard approaching, they scurried for their hiding places.
"Alpha, wait!"
Elizabeth shouted. The old Alpha paused for a moment in his tracks and looked back at Elizabeth. "I'm not leaving. Not with Demon. The Alpha hesitated as he searched for a word to describe it. It was a concept he was aware of on a gut level, but nothing he could comprehend, much less put into words. The closest the Alpha could come up with was vicious, like a biter.
"He's also our only way out."
The Alpha, however, shook his head vehemently, eyes wide in terror. "No, he's only death. He's a nightmare, a monster." Elizabeth squeezed the Alpha's shoulder.
"It's all right. I've met a few monsters in my time. I think I can deal with him."
Under her breath, she added,
"I hope I can deal with him."
"Well, there you go," Mr. Nelson called down. "My work's done here. I'm leaving."
"Come with me,"
Elizabeth pleaded.
"I don't want to leave you in a place like this."
The Alpha's answer came only in a faint whimper as the clicking began. For a moment he gazed into Elizabeth's eyes, the hair standing up on his back as he felt a terrible shadow fall across him. At last the Alpha squeezed his eyes shut and nodded.
"Ready to go, are we?"
A low, venomous, yet strangely gentle voice spoke up. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Elizabeth remembered hearing that voice before, yet she couldn't quite place it. Springs squealed as their metal joints twisted and flexed. Bits of metal rattled with excitement as his tail shook. The scarred, twisted left side of his muzzle warped and stretched as the corners of the rat's mouth pulled into a grotesque grin. Elizabeth gently caressed the Alpha's arm as she looked up into the lone visible eye, glaring deep red as it stared unblinking down at her.
"So, you must be Demon."
The nightmarish rat nodded.
"So they call me. I've had many names, but to you, on this night, I will be the delightful Dr. Chuckles, who brings laughter to the world. Though precisely whose laughter that is, I won't say."
He bowed low, uttering a low cackle.
"Everyone I like calls me Dr. Chuckles. Everyone who stands in my way calls me Demon. To those who study me, I am specimen number..."
Dr. Chuckles' eyes rolled back for a moment as he searched his memory. He fingered his mechanical arm and finally shrugged.
"I forget the number."
The Alpha shook with terror each time Dr. Chuckles spoke. He just barely managed to blubber something semi-intelligible to Elizabeth.
"Bringing a friend, are we?"
Dr. Chuckles breathed. Elizabeth put her arms around the terrified Alpha and held him close as she looked up at the strange rat.
"He's afraid of you, and something tells me I should be as well."
The rat's response came shaking from his mouth, rattled by a faint giggle.
"Afraid? Why, no one need fear Dr. Chuckles. It's only Demon he has to worry about."
The rat leaned in close to Elizabeth, the sounds of his arm clicking and grinding and hissing, growing uncomfortably loud in her ears.
"There is only one decision, my lady. Stay or go. And he would rather die than stay. So what does it matter what comes next?"
Elizabeth's chest rose and fell with her panicked breaths, her heart quaking in her very ribs. It was as if Dr. Chuckles had read her mind. She looked back down at the Alpha, where he cowered in her arms.
"All right. I won't make you come with me. But I do have to go."
The Alpha abruptly looked up.
"No, you can't." "She has to," Dr. Chuckles hissed.
Elizabeth nodded.
"He's right. I can't stay here. It would kill my very soul."
"And have you ever watched a soul die?"
Dr. Chuckles leered down at the two mice.
"It's painful to watch. Enough to make the laughing rat cry. Enough to break even me."
The Alpha gulped as he gazed into Elizabeth's eyes. As he spoke, his voice faltered often. You told me about... Please, do you love me? Elizabeth gazed back, long and hard.
I suppose I care, in a way.
Please, the Alpha whimpered. If you could have stayed, would you be my mother? Elizabeth blinked. For just a moment, the tension eased out of the air, and she felt as if she could laugh.
You want me to adopt you?
Adopt?
Never mind,
Elizabeth exclaimed. She took a deep breath and then looked back up at the old Alpha.
I have friends on the outside. If there's any way I possibly can, I'll get you out of here.
Elizabeth was silent for a moment. She wasn't sure what she was getting herself into, but as she looked into the terrified, agonized eyes of the Alpha, her mind quickly made itself up.
I promise.
There came a chuckle from overhead.
Be careful, my lady. Don't make promises you can't keep.
At last, Mr. Nelson, his patience finally giving out, spoke up.
I think I'm gonna be sick. Are we going or not?
We're going,
Elizabeth answered, yet she kept her eyes on the Alpha as she said it.
Goodbye, son.
She would have given the Alpha a final hug and a kiss on the forehead, yet at the first hint of such emotion a large, strong hand seized Elizabeth roughly by the scruff of her neck and tore her away.
Then let us be off.
Dr. Chuckles stuffed Elizabeth into a deep pocket in his coat, Mr. Nelson quickly taking the opposite side. Then the rat staggered to the nearest wall, raised his arm and the oddly familiar device strapped to it, and fired off a grappling hook. A moment later, the ground was slowly backing away as Elizabeth peered down from her unstable perch. Not long after, Dr. Chuckles landed on the ground outside.
This is where you walk,
he announced.
both of you. We must proceed quickly before the cameras switch back on, and I cannot proceed quickly and carry you both at the same time.
He means the doctor's eyes, Mr. Nelson clarified, clambering out of the rat's pocket.
So I gathered,
Elizabeth muttered, somewhat irritably under her breath, as she too emerged. Dr. Chuckles moved deceptively fast. Despite his limp, his strides carried him quickly enough that Elizabeth had to run to keep up. He led from the foot of the enclosure to the door to the chamber. This he opened by firing off his grappling hook to grab onto the door's handle, which he then pulled open by stringing the attached cord around a nearby chair's legs in a crude block-and-tackle system.
Now run! Quickly!
Dr. Chuckles shouted as he pressed a button on the back of his device. On cue, the grappling hook's prongs flipped straight up, releasing their hold on the door, which began to swing closed. The mice and rat barely slipped through in time. Next, Elizabeth found herself in a colossal passageway. Now, however, she stood on the ground, and the sheer scale of the place became evident.
Which way next?
She asked. Dr. Chuckles met her with a savage grin.
Left. Just follow the wailing of the doomed.
As Elizabeth followed, she did indeed hear a sound of pained cries. Nothing intelligible, but only wails and shrieks to express the terror, pain, and despair of not just mice and rats, but countless other larger creatures as well. Near a bend in the hall, Dr. Chuckles froze and motioned for the others to stop as well. After a moment's hesitation, he whispered,
"Hit the wall. Other side."
With that, he scurried across the hallway, Mr. Nelson at his heels. Elizabeth didn't dare hesitate, and it was a good thing she didn't. No sooner had the three squeezed up against the opposite wall than a great ape rounded the corner, immense feet thundering past against the hard floor. The mice and rat managed to hide at just the right angle to avoid notice. Dr. Chuckles peered around the corner. Looking back to Elizabeth and Mr. Nelson, he then motioned for them to follow, and rushed past the open space to continue straight ahead on their previous course. The wails grew louder as a towering door loomed ahead. Elizabeth shuddered as she imagined what could have been on the other side. Bloody operating tables, some kind of torture chamber, perhaps even a pit of hellfire. Dr. Chuckles didn't so much as pause to think. He scurried to a metal grate near the bottom of the door and pried a metal bar loose, creating an opening large enough for a rat to squeeze through, or for a mouse to crawl through quite comfortably.
"Come, my lovelies, we may have only a moment."
Though Elizabeth questioned the wisdom of doing so, she slipped through the opening in an instant. Next through was Mr. Nelson, followed by Dr. Chuckles, who snapped the metal bar back into place as he emerged into the next room. The three were met with an immediate cacophony of screams and howls. Elizabeth clapped her hands over her ears in a vain effort to block it out. In the commotion, she didn't see the rope trailing from the top of the cages on her right. Dr. Chuckles, however, spotted it in an instant, and a look of intense pleasure wormed its way across his face as he did so.
"Stay close now," he shouted over the commotion. "We're almost there."
That said, he gathered the two mice into the folds of his trench coat and hastily ushered them to the rear of the prison. Once there, he helped Elizabeth and Mr. Nelson back into his deepest pockets and fired off his grappling hook for the top of the highest cage. Animals of all varieties, mice, rats, guinea pigs, and even cats, recoiled in horror as Dr. Chuckles climbed past them. Elizabeth only caught brief glimpses of their reactions, but the sudden pockets of stillness told her all she needed to know. The inmates grew quiet the moment they saw Dr. Chuckles and would not raise their voices again until they were confident he was gone.
"Get comfortable, little ones."
Dr. Chuckles laughed as he pried open a grate in the ceiling.
"This will be a windy ride."
There was a loud metal clang as the grate shut behind him, followed immediately by the sounds of howls and wails. At first, Elizabeth questioned his remark. The air in the duct was a bit chilly, but she didn't notice any wind. She heard the click of a trigger and twang of a spring as Dr. Chuckles fired off his grappling hook, yet he didn't appear to climb up anything. There was a light buzz of a small engine as the hook's line was pulled tight, and the low clang of Dr. Chuckles' footsteps against the metal of the duct. Then it began. It started with a distant rumbling as some giant, incomprehensible machine stirred to life. Then came the roar of a hurricane. Dr. Chuckles cackled with glee as he began to slip backwards, only to stop short when his hook caught on a corner some distance ahead.
"Hunker down, friends! We may be trapped here for a while."
Dr. Chuckles turned his head downwind. Facing such a powerful rush of air head-on, it would have been impossible for him to breathe. The tails of his trench coat flapped wildly in the gale winds, the deep pockets carrying his passengers ballooning out as they caught the air. Elizabeth took the full brunt of the interior storm's wrath as it pinned her to the bottom of the pocket. She managed to turn her back to the linear hurricane, but without her cloak, the icy gale cut straight to her bones. The sound of the distant engine winding down couldn't come soon enough. Dr. Chuckles' coat fell about his waist, his passengers swinging back and forth for a short time once the winds died away. Elizabeth felt a large hand rub her shoulder through the coat's rough cloth.
"There, there, dear. I know it may be hard to believe, but this was a good sign."
Elizabeth's voice shook with her frigid shoulders as she shivered.
How could this possibly be a good sign?
She was answered with a low chuckle.
"It means we made it into hiding before the system rebooted."
Elizabeth didn't quite understand what Dr. Chuckles meant by rebooted, but she was in no mood to ask, so she kept quiet for the remainder of their journey through the air ducts.
"There we go," Jupiter announced. "See? Just a moment's inconvenience."
Peter rubbed his chin for a moment, eyeing the other rat.
"Well, that's good, I suppose."
He then turned his attention back to the monitors. He recognized the one where he had seen Elizabeth. She was no longer on camera, but there was no mistaking the scene.
"This one," Peter spoke up, tapping the screen. "I saw her in there. So the question is, where is this?"
"The location is unimportant," Jupiter answered. "All I need to know is the name. Dr. Valencia can take it from there."
A light flickered on in Peter's eyes at the mention of his idol. He glanced away from the monitors, eyebrow raised as he turned towards Jupiter.
Dr. Valencia? But how?
Jupiter smiled smugly.
I thought that might grab your attention. This way, brother.
Jupiter stepped past his workbench and felt his way along the wall, eventually coming across 3 holes similar to a bowling ball. Jupiter hooked his fingers in and pried open another hidden door. Peter raised a curious eyebrow as he followed Jupiter into the chamber beyond.
I don't mean to pry, but I do believe you're rather paranoid, Peter observed. Would I be right in thinking there's something, or perhaps someone, out to get you?
A man of my means makes enemies, Jupiter explained. Not long ago, a rather aggressive specimen escaped from his cage. I'll feel much safer when he's found.
Peter didn't notice the setup as he entered. He didn't notice the stores of food or the large monitor and control panel. Instead, he was focused on Jupiter's behavior and his comments.
Specimens, brother? You've changed. I remember a time that experimentation on specimens would have turned your stomach.
I've had to adapt, Jupiter shrugged. It wasn't easy finding a treatment for my condition. I had to test and experiment, on myself as well, of course,
he hastily added, noting the look in Peter's eyes.
And when I found a solution, of course, I was sure to share it with the other specimens.
Except the one that escaped, Peter murmured. At last he nodded. I suppose I can understand. You would have been desperate.
And in the process, I accumulated considerable resources,
Jupiter went on, as he began pressing buttons and turning dials on the control panel.
Which, I'm very glad to say, I can now put to use doing good. For you and for your friend.
Glancing towards the top of the monitor, Jupiter added,
Smile for the camera, brother.
At the top, there was indeed the faint shine of a lens in the growing light of the monitor. What caught Peter's eye next, however, was the image on the screen. The camera was looking upward, displaying the ceiling and walls of an office, and the bright, white back of a great ape in a lab coat. Peter couldn't help gaping in awe.
Good evening, Doctor,
Jupiter spoke up. The great ape turned away from his work. He was quite different from the clean-cut, professional doctor Peter remembered. Dr. Valencia's hair had grown long and unkempt, and his once clean-shaven face was peppered black, with a thick 5 o'clock shadow, though the length of the hairs was likely closer to a midnight shadow. As the doctor spoke, his voice was distorted and crackled unnaturally.
Jupiter, what is it now?
The doctor was silent for a moment, his lips visibly shaking as he looked down.
Excuse me. What I mean is... Exactly what you said,
Jupiter cut him off. Dr. Valencia grimaced and peered down at something just below his camera.
Who's your friend?
Peter Dane, sir,
Peter eagerly interjected. The doctor appeared to relax for a moment. He scratched his head and adjusted his glasses.
So you're Peter Dane, hmm? Peter who writes those little journals I have to read with a microscope.
Yes, Doctor,
Peter answered, somewhat taken aback.
It's an honor to finally speak with you.
The doctor grunted, nodding lightly.
What are you doing with... He requires access to the Utopia enclosure,
Jupiter interrupted. Dr. Valencia squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his forehead.
Right.
Which quadrant? Peter glanced uncertainly to Jupiter.
I'm not sure. I'm looking for a friend who went missing earlier tonight.
Dr. Valencia nodded impatiently.
Right, I think I know the one. Just head to the cage and I'll take you there. And watch your back.
The screen went dark with a light click as Jupiter spun a dial, abruptly powering it down.
Peter grunted. Rather a disagreeable fellow.
He's something of an acquired taste, Jupiter remarked. Well then, shall we?
So Jupiter led off for a place quite unknown to Peter. A shuttle of sorts, docked right into the side of the wall in a great ape-sized hallway. Little did either of them realize Elizabeth would not be there when they arrived at Utopia. Far away, amid the air ducts, there came the sound of metal bending and groaning in protest.
"This is it," Dr. Chuckles announced. "Journey's End."
Dr. Chuckles knelt close to the floor so that his passengers could clamber out of his pockets. As Elizabeth emerged, she found herself in a large, dark chamber. Not so large as a room built by the great apes, perhaps, but for a mouse it could have been a grand hall, stretching away into darkness. Wait, no, Elizabeth realized. It wasn't a chamber or a hall, but a rift, an empty space between two air ducts. A bright light illuminated one end, the end Elizabeth was standing at, and plunged all beyond its scope into pitch darkness. Elizabeth blinked as she looked into the light. One end of the space was entirely taken up by a large monitor and a small console of controls. She gasped as she saw what was on display. An immense image of Peter and herself, and a pair of ferrets dressed as aliens, all cowering in terror. The location was familiar as well. Elizabeth's stomach growled just at the memory of the Great Ape Fairground and all the abandoned food littering the ground. Yet as she put two and two together, hunger was the last thing on her mind. Then there came an ominous sound of metal groaning as Dr. Chuckles pried the entrance closed once more, sealing off the three of them from the outside world. Elizabeth whirled about, in time to see the rat looming forward, the right, normal side of his face hidden in shadow, and the horrifically deformed, cancerous left side suddenly revealed in the monitor's light, his mouth slashed open in a vicious grin.
You!
Elizabeth gasped.
That was you?
"Who sent the Arnold?"
Dr. Chuckles finished the thought for her.
"Yes, it was me."
Elizabeth found herself glancing about for an escape route, but all she saw was the operating table, laden with various sharp tools and streaked with coppery stains.
But why? What did we do?
You did nothing, Dr. Chuckles cut her off.
Your involvement in it all was purely incidental.
Yet that didn't stop him from staggering towards Elizabeth as he spoke. Elizabeth instinctively backed away.
Who are you? And what do you want?
She stumbled, her feet tripping over wires and metal rods that littered the ground.
"Simply another lost soul," Dr. Chuckles explained, his voice vibrating with restrained laughter. "As to your second question, I want you to keep retreating."
What?
Elizabeth began to say, only for something to click under her foot with her next step. All at once, a multitude of metal rods flew up around her, snapping together at the top to form a crude cage.
"Do you like it?"
Dr. Chuckles leaned back, considerably more relaxed now that his trap was sprung.
"I spent a great deal of time planning it out, just for you."
Elizabeth glared up at the rat and heaved a sigh of annoyance.
So you moved me from one cage to another. What have you accomplished?
Dr. Chuckles shrugged and flashed a satisfied grin.
"I prefer this location. It makes it so much more convenient when all the pieces are in one place. So much easier to maintain control."
Of what? Me?
Dr. Chuckles shook his head.
"Not you. As I said, your part in this is purely incidental. Anyone would have done, really. All I needed was bait."
Elizabeth's heart pounded as the rat's words rang in her ears.
Bait? For what?
"For my dear brother, of course."
That was when Elizabeth knew where she had heard that voice before. She could see it spoken with another face in the back of her mind.
Thraxis.
Dr. Chuckles' grin vanished, his expression turning to an ugly scowl. He looked away for a moment, and very slightly he nodded.
"In my darkest nightmares, yes."
Elizabeth felt lightheaded, as what she thought had been no more than a dream turned to a nightmarish reality, and this time Dawn would not be coming to her rescue.
What are you going to do? Kill him?
Dr. Chuckles turned his gaze back to Elizabeth, his voice shaking with suppressed laughter, yet his expression was utterly devoid of pleasure.
I haven't decided.
With that, Dr. Chuckles turned to the console in front of the monitor. He flipped a switch and spun a dial. The image on the screen switched to a live feed from a camera mounted near the ceiling of a hallway. It then cycled through several other cameras until the screen settled on an image of the Utopia enclosure, where, just then, a cage had been set into one of the civilized quadrants, the very section Elizabeth had just vacated. One end was pulled open, and out stepped a very familiar rat. Peter scanned the enclosure with a careful eye. Every mouse was nearly identical, so Elizabeth should have stood out like a sore thumb. A large crowd gathered around, drawn by the unusual occurrence, though they gave the rat a wide berth. "Bess," Peter called out. "Elizabeth! Miss Hartley!" 3 mice strode to the forefront and gave a deep bow.
"Peace, big brother," the tallest of the 3 greeted. "Allow me to be the first to welcome our new alpha."
Peter raised a curious eyebrow. "Alpha?"
Generally the largest, strongest mouse of the bunch, Jupiter explained from the rear of the cage. As a rat, you have a clear advantage.
"Yes, I'm familiar with the term," Peter interjected. "But why would I be alpha of a group of mice? I can't very well breed with them." The leader of the 3 mice glanced at his 2 compatriots.
"Well, man, if that's your attitude, then I'm the new alpha."
"No," shouted the smallest. "I want to be the new alpha." And he pounced on the largest, wrapping his arms around the mouse's neck.
"You have to beat me first, man,"
the first mouse shouted back, thrusting 2 of his fingers into the second's eyes. The 2 tussled back and forth for a time, savagely slapping, punching, and kicking each other, until, exhausted, they collapsed into a heap. The 3rd mouse glanced down at them and shrugged.
"I guess that makes me a new alpha."
The others looked at each other, eyes burning with rage, and then they leapt upon the 3rd, starting the whole thing over again. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," Peter shouted over the commotion, "but I'm looking for someone, and I was under the impression she would be here." The 3 mice froze, looking up at Peter expectantly. "She's a mouse, about so high, with light brown fur and large, kindly eyes." "I thought you weren't interested in mice," the 2nd mouse shouted. "She's a personal friend whom I've come to liberate from this place."
"We're all liberated here, man," the 1st mouse answered. "Liberated from worldly cares, from predators, and the reckless need to search for food."
"From fun and excitement," the 3rd mouse muttered, and he proceeded to chew on the 2nd mouse's ear. The struggle thus resumed.
"Indeed," the 1st mouse agreed, as the pile of them slowly rolled away. "This is the most excitement we've had in ages."
Peter heaved an irritated sigh and gazed at the various other mice in turn. "Surely one of you must have seen her. Rather an attractive young lady, quite distinct from the rest of you. She may have looked different, smelled different, or acted different."
Well,
A small, snowy white woman spoke up.
there was a female alpha for a while, until Demon took her away.
Peter glanced to Jupiter for an explanation. The other rat simply shrugged.
"Yeah," another woman agreed, "and she sure acted strangely."
A 3rd woman gave a haughty sniff.
"She talked about love and mothers and expected us to take care of those loud, squealing little things that grow inside us."
"And then someone took her away," Peter finished. All at once, the crowd of mice grew silent. They exchanged uneasy glances, and several of them nodded intermittently. "Who is this demon fellow?" Peter asked. As one body, the mice looked to the ground. One by one they dispersed, crawling into hiding places and averting their gazes. All save for one, a tall, scarred, muscular fellow. He was no monster, but for a typical mouse, he was certainly impressive. Peter crossed his arms, meeting the mouse's gaze.
You seem to be braver than the others. Perhaps you would care to explain.
The mouse nodded slowly, his eyes flashing with suspicion. She said she had friends on the outside. He glanced up at the great ape looming over the enclosure. She said she would take me away from here if she could.
Done, Peter agreed. Now, what about this demon we keep hearing about? The other mice seem rather disturbed at the mere mention of him.
The mouse flinched.
You too,
The mouse nodded. He's smart, very smart, but he's also mean. I once saw him tear apart the Alpha before me. That is how I became Alpha. Jupiter gulped uneasily. That could explain the outages we've been suffering. He comes and goes at will, the mouse went on. I don't think the doctors know about him. He claimed to be a doctor. Dr. Chuckles.
And Elizabeth left in his company, Peter mused. That doesn't sound at all like old Bess.
She hated this place, the mouse added. She said she would rather die than stay.
Peter mumbled. After a time, he nodded toward the cage. All right, then. Step inside and wait for me. As intriguing as our discussion has been, I would still like to take a last look around for myself.
The former Alpha eagerly darted past Peter, barely hearing anything past step inside, and his joy at his newfound freedom. Peter, meanwhile, made a last sweep around the quadrant before climbing the ramp into the neighboring section. The feral biters watched Peter with great interest, but between his size and his scent, they gave him a wide berth. His smell was subtly familiar to them, distinct from that of demon, but far too close to ignore. The reception was comparable in each quadrant Peter visited, with the locals, feral or not, keeping their distance. Disappointed, dejected, and thoroughly disturbed, Peter returned to the cage. The entrance snapped closed, and Dr. Valencia lifted it out of the enclosure and carried the cage away to the dock from which it had been taken. There was a light click, and the screen switched back to the still image of Peter and the others back at the fairground.
Excellent,
Dr. Chuckles breathed. He flashed a grotesque grin as he glanced to his diminutive sidekick.
Mr. Nelson, our guests will be coming soon. Let us prepare a proper welcome.
You don't know that,
Elizabeth whispered. Dr. Chuckles raised an eyebrow in feigned curiosity and turned his attention to his captive.
Don't I? Please, my lady, elaborate.
Elizabeth looked away, wrapping her arms around herself to ease her panicked shaking.
They have no way of knowing we're here. At best, they'll just wander around and find us by accident.
She was answered with a low laugh.
Good. Then I'll have more time to prepare.
Dr. Chuckles seized up a wire, and then a metal rod, and then glanced toward the ceiling.
Mr. Nelson, gather up some rope.
There should be a fair coil in the stash. The little mouse nodded and scampered away into the darkness. Dr. Chuckles, in the meantime, wrapped the wire around a metal rod and then staggered to a pile of refuse where he sifted through the junk. Elizabeth watched the rat's frenzied activity for a time. Initially, he carried on quite oblivious to her. After a while, however, Dr. Chuckles took notice of her gaze. He straightened up, tapping his strange new creation in one hand, and stared back at Elizabeth.
Oh, I beg your pardon, my lady. I imagine you have a great many questions. Go on, then. Ask away. I am at your disposal.
Elizabeth shook her head, her glare remaining firmly fixed on the rat.
No, really. So, dear Romulus explained everything then, did he?
He didn't have to. I've seen your type before.
A look of immense amusement crossed Dr. Chuckles' face. He cocked his head to one side with a low chuckle.
Have you now? I doubt that.
He flexed his metal hand for emphasis. The fingers flipped backwards, each joint inverting so that the hand was suddenly facing the other direction. A second flex flipped them back into their proper positions.
Fancy.
Elizabeth remarked, unimpressed.
But pure evil is still pure evil, even if you tie it up with a nice ribbon.
Dr. Chuckles grinned. His chest rattled with repressed laughter, which bubbled up in his throat in a series of painful coughs.
Evil, am I? And what do you know of pure evil,
He leaned closer, the shadows fading from the twisted half of his face as it emerged into the light.
Would you care for a lesson?
Elizabeth backed away, squeezing against the other side of her little cage.
Thank you. No. I already know enough.
But you got me so excited for a monologue, and I so love giving a good monologue.
Elizabeth didn't have an answer. She just stared back at the terrifying rat, waiting for the next hammer to drop. Dr. Chuckles leaned his head to the other side, cracking a faint smirk.
You need not fear me, my lady. I have no intention of hurting you. I promise.
But you plan to hurt a good friend of mine,
Elizabeth retorted. Dr. Chuckles grinned, the left side of his face twisting into a maze of black chasms.
And you need to choose better friends. This Don fellow, for instance.
Dr. Chuckles glanced about himself in a mockery of a search.
Where is he now? Not rescuing you, I can tell.
Elizabeth grew still. Her terror faded, replaced instead with a deep, painful longing. Her momentary grief then faded into an intense but ultimately impotent rage. She simply turned away and closed her eyes.
I see. I am sorry, my lady, truly. I'll speak no more of the matter.
Thank you,
Elizabeth whispered. There was a brief silence before Dr. Chuckles spoke again.
It's always the ones we love most, isn't it? The ones who wound us the most deeply.
Elizabeth sighed, squeezing her eyes shut.
And what would you know about love? Would you care for a lesson?
I know it involves putting another before yourself. Comforting them when they're afraid. Backing them up in a conflict. And helping to make peace when the dust settles. I know it involves listening when they speak. Holding them as they cry. And tending to the scrapes and bruises of their youth. And I know it involves staying by their side. When all else has turned against them.
Dr. Chuckles paused for a moment.
Am I getting close, my lady?
Elizabeth turned around to see the rat staring intently at her. She nodded. Dr. Chuckles grunted softly and turned back to his work.
I envy you. I really do.
Really?
Elizabeth growled.
I lost everything. You know, everyone I ever cared about.
Perhaps, Dr. Chuckles mused. But you still have your love, and I find it far more pleasant to love than to hate.
Then why don't you? Love instead of hate.
The rat laughed, softly at first, a low, growling chuckle, which slowly rose into a mad cackle.
I've enjoyed our little chat, but I'm afraid it's time for it to end.
With that, he threw a cloth over Elizabeth's cage, plunging her into darkness.
Rest, my lady. I want you to put on a good show for my brother.
Thus, the web of plots and schemes grew ever more entangled. Which hand was doing what? Which hand knew what which hand was doing? So many parts moving independently, without knowledge of others' intent. And at that moment, as three traveled from one place to another, three more met, alone, agitated, to hatch plots and schemes of their own.